We as gamers don't decipher the difference between good and bad difficulty enough. Our failure to discern the difference between good and bad difficulty does two things. One, it prevents us from fully appreciating good difficulty. And two, it prevents us from calling out bad difficulty. As a result, there are times where we'll tell someone to get good while they're calling out bad difficulty. However, there are also times where people will complain about good difficulty in the same fashion, but because our response is get good to pretty much every difficulty complaint, no one can truly tell if it's a skill issue or a balance issue. The response of get good to every difficulty complaint without discernment is a key point of toxicity in these gaming discussions, because it collapses all nuance and legitimate criticism into a supposed lack of player skill. Individual player skill is a terrible baseline for judging how difficult a game is, because with enough time, players can do pretty much anything. The best Hollow Knight players can literally speedrun modded bosses like any Radiance, but no one should ever expect 99% of players to make it through even 5 seconds of that fight. However, I would argue that any Radiance is an example of good difficulty. Not because it's unreasonably hard, but because that over-the-top challenge was the intent of the design. After all, if player skill alone doesn't define difficulty, then the real difference between good and bad difficulty has to come from the design itself. I feel like Malenia is a good case study for both good and bad difficulty, specifically her heal on hit effect and waterfowl dance. But before anything else, I need to explain her design intent. After all, it's design intent that determines good and bad difficulty. Malenia is a dance-type boss fight which focuses on flow and finding your turn to attack by dodging precisely. I would consider her the same archetype of boss as someone like Nightmare King Grimm. This type of boss tends to have fast patterns you need to anticipate, which is why you can easily predict the attack/combo Malenia is going to use by looking at her sword or body position. Because when the attack launches, it comes too fast to reasonably predict. Malenia's heal on hit effect serves this design because it encourages players to not attempt trading hits with her. You're supposed to wait your turn, not try damage trading. By adding the heal on hit effect, even players with high poison shields will feel forced to play by her rules, because the heal happens even if she doesn't do damage to you. Waterfowl, however, is where I would say Malenia crosses into bad difficulty. A lot of players defend this move because it is dodgeable, and there are technically ways to deal with it if you practice enough. But this goes back to point 1. Player skill is not what determines whether difficulty is good or bad. It's the design intent that does. Malenia is designed as a dance-style boss. The fight wants you to enter a flow state where you read her movements, anticipate her attacks, and respond with precise dodges before taking your turn. Most of her moves reinforce this rhythm. Shoot, the first time I beat her, I was 75% through the second phase when I realized I actually had her health bar low and I hadn't healed since the very beginning of the fight. And like I said, most of her moves reinforce that hypnotic rhythm, but Waterfowl doesn't. The problem is almost entirely in the startup. When Malenia jumps in the air, you have around 2 seconds before the attack begins. On paper, that sounds reasonable. The issue is that Malenia has another jump attack with a near identical startup. Until the very last moment, both attacks look identical. You can only tell which move she's using at the peak of the jump. For the other attack, her prosthesis snaps at the top of the jump. But for Waterfowl, she'll float higher and enter her signature position. So in reality, players have around 1 second to recognize what's happening and prepare. Now factor in human reaction time. The average reaction time is about 1/4 of a second, and that's just to process what you're seeing. That leaves most players with less than a second to commit to a specific and demanding response. Unlike your other jump attack, which requires a single dodge, Waterfowl demands multiple precise inputs with minimal margin for error. Waterfowl forces players out of that rhythm that the rest of the fight trains them to maintain, because instead of flowing with Malenia, you're bracing, panicking, or disengaging entirely just in case you're in a bad position for that one attack. So, for most players, Waterfowl breaks the fight's flow, and that directly contradicts the design of the fight. Just a little bit more detail in the startup, even something as simple as wind swirling beneath her feet would be more than enough to differentiate Waterfowl from the other attack, and that would probably be more than enough to prevent the attack from breaking the fight's flow. Now, I'm one of the players that didn't struggle as much with Waterfowl, especially because I had these strategies in place to kind of mitigate the flow and momentum break that it would have. But even still, I recognize that in order to engage with people who believe that this move is way too broken, in order to engage with them in the best way possible, I needed to set aside my bias and kind of pay closer attention to kind of see where they were coming from. And when I learned the fight and I fully understood what her moveset was and kind of identified what attacks would lead to what, that's when I noticed the similarities between the two attack patterns. And I feel like this is something that all of us realize at least subconsciously. But because we're so busy fighting for our lives, we tend to not really pay attention to these details, at least actively. So because of that, I'm not demonizing people who talk saying like, oh, I didn't struggle with her that much, or people that say some people are exaggerating because it wasn't that big of a deal for them to deal with. I'm not gonna demonize them because the reality is, most of the time, we only have our personal experience with a boss fight to go off of. We shouldn't expect everybody who gives their take online to know the ins and outs of bosses or to have a background in game design. But I would ask for all of us to put our biases aside and try to engage more fruitfully and understand where everyone else is coming from. Because difficulty in video games isn't just about seeing how good a player is, because if it were, early game bosses would be much closer in difficulty to the end game bosses than they actually are. Instead, it's about how well the game communicates its rules and design while challenging players. So I feel like we can say I didn't struggle with Waterfowl Dance while also saying even though I didn't struggle, I can see why it isn't unfair or why it isn't consistent with the design Malenia was going for. And I genuinely feel like if we as a community recognize this, our discussions about difficulty will be more meaningful, and we'll gain a deeper appreciation for what makes a challenge truly good.